This is the eLearn podcast. If you're passionate about the future of learning, you're in the right place. The expert guests on this show provide insights into the latest strategies, practices, and technologies for creating killer online learning outcomes. My name's Laddick, and I'm your host from Open LMS. The eLearn podcast is sponsored by eLearn Magazine, your go-to resource for all things online learning. Click-by-click how-to articles, the latest in EdTech, spotlight on successful outcomes and trends in the marketplace. Subscribe today and never miss a post at elearnmagazine.com. And Open LMS, a company leveraging open source software to deliver effective, customized, and engaging learning experiences for schools, universities, companies, and governments around the world since 2005. Learn more at openlms.net. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the eLearn podcast. My name is Laddick, as you've probably heard now at least 4 or 5 times. I work with a company called Open LMS, but this show is not about me. This show is about my guest here today, Mr. Clark Quinn from Quinnovation. How are you, Clark?
I'm good. Thank you, Laddick.
It's excellent to finally meet you. As I do always, where do we find you sitting in the world?
I'm in Walnut Creek, California, which is Bay Area, a little bit inland.
Strangely enough, I know exactly where that is. That's amazing. How's the Bay Area? We're recording this on September 5th. If I've been reading the news correctly, it has been something of a crazy weather year. Does that mean cool, hot, wet, windy? What?
Yes, all of the above. Crazy weather. We had more rain than usual. Our temperature has gone up and down more. So instead of sort of a steady heat with a few hot days, we've had some really hot days. We've had some really cold days. It's just just wackier.
General chaos, much like the L&D universe, I think, over the last 4 or 5 years. Before we dive into our conversation today around how we actually move the L&D world into the 21st century, because we're already 23 years into that century. Let's tell us about who you are. I mean, so many people have already heard your name. I've heard your name forever. Give us sort of the 90 seconds on who you are and what you focus on.
My sympathies. So I saw the connection between computers and learning as an undergraduate, designed my own major. It's been my career ever since. Back then, we didn't have the term e-learning. Who coined it in the late 90s, we were doing stuff a long time before then. My first job out of college was designing and programming educational computer games. And that focus on combining engagement with effective education has remained a recurrent theme in my work, including games. I went back because I knew we didn't know enough. And I went back and got a PhD in what was effectively applied cognitive science. And I did the academic route for a while, joined a couple government startups, came back to this country to work with develop an adaptive learning platform a couple decades before we started really doing this. And for the past couple decades, I've been an independent consultant assisting organizations to take what we know about how our brains work, how we think, work, and learn, and apply that to the design of solutions to make organizations more effective.
Fantastic. I am sure that you have helped thousands and thousands of people. So what do we get right in L&D now? It's 2023, and what are we doing right now that we've come out of the pandemic? We're in this now like definitively hybrid universe. So online learning or that the virtual environment's no longer a nice to have. It's just everybody's assuming it, etc. What are we doing well?
We are learning to use the tools in ways that are effective. I sort of argue at after 9/11, nobody wanted to travel. We started saying, oh, well, let's do e-learning. But the problem is we gave everybody authoring tools, and we took anybody who'd been a face-to-face trainer, said, you're now an instructional designer. We had a lot of information dump going on. I think over the past couple decades since then, we've begun to be aware of learning science. We're beginning to incorporate that into what we do. As you point out, with COVID in particular, we learned we could do online learning, and it wasn't horrible. It wasn't necessarily better. There was some research done from SRI that said online is actually better than face-to-face. But there was a caveat to that, and that was, if you take the time to redesign. And really, it was, to me, more about the design than the technology. And I think that's still true. So I think we are increasingly aware of what we can do. There's still a bunch of structural constraints that make it difficult to do as well as we can. And some of that blame we can lay at our own feet as well.
So what are those common barriers? I guess before I ask you about the barriers, what is it that we don't do well? Like, if we're starting to get it, if things are being produced that, hey, we're learning some stuff, learning science is coming into it, cognitive development, et cetera. What are those gaps that you still see time and again, every time you sort of work with clients?
Yeah, it's funny. Depends on if you see the glass as half full or half empty. I had a conversation with our colleague Will Tallheimer, and he was going, L&D really wants to do better, but the layers above keep constraining them to just do ordinary stuff and don't resource them appropriately. But I came back and said, yes, but we're also our own worst enemy. So what we're doing is, despite we're increasing our use of learning science, there's still a lot of places that aren't. We're still doing a lot of information dump. There's this view that if we give people new information, they'll change their behavior, despite the robust evidence that that's not true. You can look at behavioral economics or cognitive psychology, and you will see that people do a lot of irrational things, right? And we now have evidence that what it takes to make persistent behavior change requires a fair amount of practice and across appropriate contexts. And I don't see enough of that. We still train until they get it right instead of until they can't get it wrong. And I would argue the most important thing we're not doing is we're not measuring in any meaningful way. We measure completion. We may measure smile sheets and see if they liked it. The only problem with that is the correlation between people's assessment of how effective learning is and its actual impact is about 0. It's 0.09, which is 0 with a rounding error. And that's just not very good, right? We really need to be looking at it. And then, once we start measuring, we can start looking at other approaches. There are times when trying to put it in the head is just wrong. If it's too long between the time you learn it and when you have to practice it, it'll be gone. Put the information in the world, job aids, performance support. We're neglecting that. We're neglecting our potential role in informal and social learning. When you're doing innovation, when you're doing problem solving and research and design, you don't know the answer when you start. That's learning too. It's not formal learning. There isn't anybody with the answer you could bring in, or you would, right? But you need to figure it out. You need good practices of learning, good practice of experimentation. We can help there too. And that gives us a much more central role to the success of the organization. Increasingly, people are saying, as things go faster, continual innovation is going to be the only sustainable differentiator. We could be there. We should be there.
Yeah, 100%. So tease that out a little bit for me, because I get fascinated by this particular piece of the conversation personally. How do we participate as a learning? And I want to be clear, and I'd appreciate it if you'd maybe make the delineation or the distinction for me. Does what we're going to talk about, does this bleed into what we would consider traditional higher education, K through 12, everything? Or are we talking specifically about just adult learning?
My short answer is yes.
Yeah.
It should and could bleed into K-12 and higher ed. Right now, I'm largely talking organizational learning and adult learning. I don't like the andragogy movement, because what that did was said, oh, well, creative and meaningful learning is what adults need. What we do, we can do anything to kids. That's not true. They care about meaningful learning too. Our brain architecture doesn't suddenly change when we become an adult. In fact, what is the measure of when we're an adult? It's pretty fuzzy at best, right? It depends on a whole bunch of things. Some people are thrust into it well before they're ready. The point I want to make, how do we do this? How do we get started? I argue that the most important thing for formal learning is to start measuring, as I said. But for informal learning and innovation, I think the first step we have to do is start doing it internally. We need to start experimenting systematically, smartly. We need to start sharing where we're at and where we're going and working out loud. We need to find effective ways to communicate and collaborate. When we get ownership of that internal to L&D, we then have a credible case to say we're now ready to take it forward to the rest of the organization. So I think the way we get there is by demonstrating it, practicing it ourselves, and making sure we understand it and take advantage of that.
So we had two people who commented actually before we even started today, which I found fascinating. I want to thank Christina Rodier, and Anna Santos for chiming in and saying hello there on LinkedIn. But let's just assume Christina and Anna are, learning designers. They're in a corporation somewhere. I have no idea what their background is. They're probably both excellent professionals. But take me through the process, or what your thinking would be if, I'm either a junior or mid-career learning designer. I'm in an organization that's thriving. I am excited and I want to be more effective. What's your, sort of sage advice for, here's the steps I'd take to do this internally, prove it works, on us, and then start to be a champion for it and be effective within the organization?
Well, in a role, learning designer role, the first thing I truly believe you need to know is understand is cognitive science and learning science. You just need that core human information processing loop to understand how we perceive, what we attend to is what gets into working memory, what we need to get from working memory into long-term memory, how that works, how we need to get it back out. You really need that, core basis. And then there are layers on top of that, the role of mental models, the role of examples, the nuances around practice. There's a lot more that goes into that. You have to understand that actually applies not only to formal learning, it applies to the design of performance support. It also applies to the approaches you take to foster innovation. For instance, we know that hearing somebody else's thoughts before you formalize yours kind of constrains your thinking, which is why brainstorming, they said didn't work, because that old model of brainstorming was bring everybody in a room, share the problem, start talking. You need time for everybody to think on their own. You won't understand that if you don't have this basis of cognitive science. Then you need to look at what the evidence says about how people work best. And that includes, having time for reflection, valuing diversity, not just tolerating it, but valuing it, having an open mind to new ideas, having a process to explore them, having a tolerance for failure. Recognize that, with experiments, there's a 50-50 chance it won't work. Know what you're going to test and what you will learn from it either way. So therefore, when you do have a failure, it's not a loss, it's a learning. Those sorts of principles, then you apply that internally, so you apply it in your design of solutions to others, but you start applying it internally to create a self-improving loop. And then finally, when you understand it, known it, then you have a basis to take it out for the rest of the organization. So that's sort of my process is, for your formal learning, get that core down, and then start measuring and have evidence that'll tell you whether what you're doing is good or not. And measuring, I'm not talking about measuring how much does it cost to have a bum in a seat for an hour. I'm talking about measuring, is this moving a needle in the organization? And then internally start practicing all those innovative continual improvement practices, take ownership of them, and then bring them to the rest of the organization. Go, we can help you be more effective too.
Have you found, oh, sorry, I apologize. Have you found along that pathway, there's kind of two thoughts I have there, understanding the cognitive science. We had another comment come in here. It doesn't give your name, unfortunately, but they said they love focusing on neuroscience as well. Sort of understanding the cognitive science, understanding the learning pathways, the modalities, etc. Is it just your own personal savvy of knowing when and what situation where to say, hey, actually, we designed this because, Kirkpatrick says, or, and, in other words, it's just say, hey, no, look, we're going to do it this way because I'm not sure if I'm asking that question correctly, but you see what I'm saying? Like, what savvy do you need as a learning designer in an organization to know when to be the smartass and when to be the academic and when to sort of be like, hey, look, when to just sort of lead?
Yeah, it's easier to get forgiveness than permission. So many times I argue, do the right thing. You can do better multiple choice questions that aren't just knowledge tests, but are actually mini scenarios. You should just already start doing that. Organization I'm working with, Upside Learning, they are beginning to do that, right? But I think the point of citing people and when you should share your knowledge is when people are trying to push back on your expertise and tell you, oh, I understand learning. No, you don't. That's my area of expertise. So you need to maintain their respect for your expertise just as you respect their expertise. That's a really important boundary that has to work there. But then you have to understand that despite the robust decades of evidence we have about how important, space practice is and repeated practice and varied practice, the exact amount depends on a number of factors, like how complex it is inherently, how frequently you perform it in the real world, how important it is if you get it wrong. Nobody's got the exact formula. So you're going to create your best guess based upon those scientific principles. And then you need to test it to see if it's met your levels. And you should have expectations that says, this will be good enough, this won't. And you test until you reach there. That's how we should be doing it. That's how it works in other industries and other areas of the business. We should be doing that too. Not just if we build it, it is good.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So then take me there, because I love the idea and the, from your perspective, it's like, look, get your house in order. And I say this to my kids all the time: ask for forgiveness. Don't ask for permission. Beg for forgiveness. Anyway, they didn't hear me say that. So getting your house in order is one thing, but now talk to me about the measurement side of things. If I'm in the C-suite, if I'm in the EVP level, I'm interested in business goals. I'm interested in business metrics and whatnot. What are your advice, or how do you work with others to be savvy about talking to that crowd and making learning important, making learning, essential, and showing how this piece within the organization that everyone is touched by is moving metrics?
Right. It's a complex story. So, but this fairly simple version is we shouldn't be making a course unless we know how we will be sure it's worked. In other words, we shouldn't just take an order. We need a course and go to the SME and they'll give you an information dump and you dump that information on learners and we're done. That's not going to make any change in the organization. So we need to work with our business partners. When they come to us, we should have a process that says, here's how we break things down. Here's how we ask the questions. Here's how we make sure this isn't a situation where training will help. Mm-hmm. There are lots of performance problems that training won't address. People could do it if their life depended on it, but they're not for other reasons. Training isn't going to change that probably. And if it's the wrong people or they don't have the right resources, if there's unrealistic expectations, they're not going to be able to do it. So then, and then there are times when it's better to create a job aid than to create training. And then when we create training, we should make it right. When it absolutely positively has to be in the head, we put it in the head effectively and we demonstrate and we show that not only were they able to do it at the end of learning, they're doing it in the workplace and it's changing things. That's the measurement we need. That's what we should be taking to it. I continue to think that eventually CFOs are going to get wise and come back to us and say, how do we know that the money we're giving you is actually leading to change in the organization? Instead of it's just we give you money and everybody believes it leads to good outcomes. Eventually, I think somebody's going to start calling us on that and we have to be better prepared. And I'd rather us do that before that happens.
Sure, yeah. So, and is there, and this is a totally innocent question, just only because I'm always sensitive to that, where it's like, hey, look, I gave you $1 or, a peso or whatever it is, and I want you to show me how that moved some needle, some percentage or whatever. In your experience, are there other conversations that are more important? Obviously, businesses are, they're economic vehicles, that's a really, really important part of the conversation. But we also know that, employee morale and well-being and, onboarding new employees is an important process, et cetera, et cetera. Are there ways to talk about successes that you've had, sentiment and those kinds of things that aren't necessarily, dollar for dollar tracking, or is that always the case?
I argue that in general, pretty much everything, there should be metrics that show us what we're doing and we can attach dollar cost to those. I don't believe in pure ROI because you could have a very small initiative that has a much better ROI than this one, but this one's going to have a much bigger impact and it's probably a better value because it's more important to the organization. But you do need to say that what we're spending is worth what we're receiving for it. But even things like onboarding, how much time till they're proficient is a metric. It's not just, they're onboarded. How do you know they're onboarded? How do you know they won't leave? What have you done? Are you reducing retention? Are you increasing the quality of people? Are you building the right skill sets amongst the employee base? There are lots of things. And this happened a long time ago. People were talking about social media and they're saying, if people are active in a social environment, that's your metric. And they charge by that. And it was like, well, no, if you put it in sales and you have activity, should metrics in sales improve? If you put it in operations, what metrics about, reducing error rates or increasing throughput or whatever things should occur from having people conversing and becoming better at problem solving effectively? And so I don't totally believe in metrics. I believe there's some things that we possibly invest in because we know they're good, like learning to learn. But I think eventually we can tie real value to this. And so, I think we should.
Fantastic.
At least to start.
So talk to me about the learning experience design, or the design of the learning experience, both in terms of the tools we use, the platforms we use, but then getting creative about the variety of experience. You've touched on it a number of times here over the last 20 minutes already, where, hey, a work aid may be a more appropriate piece than a formal learning. And in this case, you may need send people to an LMS, but in other cases, this should be a mentoring relationship. Talk to me about those complexities and managing that portfolio, either as an individual or as a team. Is this something where, again, it's another area of potential specialization for an L&D person, or I'm going to leave it there. What does your experience show you?
To me, it's not about the platform or the tools. It's about the process. It's about starting up front and analyzing who is the audience, what is the need, what cognitive changes do we need? So getting back to the cognitive and learning science, then we say, how do we deliver it? What experience will make that change? Then finally, we can get to the platform and tools and say which one will allow us to build that. So you say, and there are other factors that go into it. So is coaching easily available, or is it a very hard to manage resource? Do we need an immersive environment? We have a bad habit, back to your very early question, what are we doing wrong? Chasing shiny objects. And, I argue we'll get much more value out of investing and making sure we've got the learning science and the process down before we go to to VR, AR, AI, all the, acronyms. We need to understand what cognitive changes we need, and then how do we bring those about? And we then create an experience that includes that. And it might be simulation practice followed by coaching in the workplace. In fact, that's probably a good recipe anyways. I love the person who told me that they never released learning without having also addressed how the coaches or supervisors are going to support this. I thought that was a really interesting, sensible thing to do, to say, you can send somebody through learning, they go back to the workplace and immediately gets extinguished. That's not how we do it here.
Sure, 100%,
that doesn't help, right? How do you make sure that coaching is going to happen and happen effectively? So it's a bigger shift. So yes, you start with designing better learning experiences and measuring it and looking for outcomes. Ultimately, it'll come into creating a culture where there's inbuilt coaching as part of how people act. Increasingly, there's arguments that management is really becoming coaching.
Well, yeah, and what you're engendering in my head right now, like what's popping up is, the thing of the elementary school sort of classic model that you and I grew up with, where it's like, your kid came home with their math textbook, but then there was also the textbook for the teacher. You know what I mean? And I feel like, would you agree there's an analogy here where it's like, look, you're going to build maybe a skill building thing or a soft skill thing or whatever for the team here. But then leadership also needs to have something as well to say, hey, look, here's what we just taught them. Here's how you support it. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That's
quite honestly, I don't think I've ever seen that done. I don't think I've ever seen that done, but maybe I'm wrong.
I'm seeing it increasingly that people are saying, let's have our manager, when you do a big program, you train the staff, you train the managers, and increasingly you have to think about any intervention is really an organizational change. And you need to treat it as such, and you may need to sell it to people. I love the guy I heard, Peter Dieger, talked about change. He said, there's this myth that people resist change. People don't resist change. They make changes all the time. They get married, they change job, they buy a new house. They resist changes that are imposed upon them.
They don't understand. That don't make sense, right?
Right. But he says, make it a choice. If what differentiates those are changes they've chosen, make it a choice. Say, we can stay here or we can go to here. If you do that right, it should be pretty obvious this is better. Then you sustain it through it. And that happens just down at the e-learning level, as well as at the, changing the culture of the organization level.
I had this, and you tell me if I'm crazy, but I had this brain, and this is, again, I'm not making this up. This is 72 hours old for me, where I was taking a hike with a friend, and on the hike, at least 2 or 3 times, they referred to the fact that they are not a scientist, right? I'm not sure what we were talking about. I said, but it dawned on me. I said, well, actually, this is really an analogy to what you were just talking about. You and I experiment every day, right? We have a hypothesis about, hey, will my car start when it's cold? Hey, I'm going to go try it, and then you work through that hypothesis, and then yes, the car started. So we do this, we go through the scientific method. It sounds like you are, a proponent of that as well. It's like, let's stop assuming that we don't know. And let's start, assuming that, people are more adult, bigger, human, more mature, all of those things. And let's meet them at that level. Would I have that right?
I think that's right, is that we can be more systematic. And one of the things we know is a bunch of our folk beliefs about learning and a variety of other things actually aren't accurate. Mm. And we should be fostering, way back when the late Jay Cross, who wrote the book Informal Learning, used to talk about, maybe the best investment you can make is helping your people learn better. Teach them. We have this initiative, Meta Learning Lab. It didn't succeed. I think it was a decade or so too early, but the focus, actually almost 2 decades now. But the notion is that if you got your people to learn more effectively and work more effectively, be more systematic, more scientific in just their everyday things, you get this improvement, and it may be the best investment. We see this in software engineering with Watts Humphrey's personal software process, team software process, where all they did was they reviewed what they did and found their own mistakes and improved them. And that led to big improvements in their software process. Why shouldn't we do that in a learning process and any other process we're engaged in? And yes, one of the reasons I think more people should understand cognitive science is almost everybody in some way designs for humans. Mm-hmm. And if you understand humans better and not the myths, you look at a whole bunch of HR. It's interesting, you were mentioning earlier about, morale and stuff, and some of that stuff, I'd say that's not L&D's role, right? There are other people who are supposed to be responsible for that. But I think in all these things, the more you understand people and their foibles and not having the mistakes, we see a bunch of practices in HR that are still essentially based on us being formal logical reasoners, like yearly reviews. The thought that feedback, some months later is actually going to lead to any meaningful change isn't helpful. You need much more frequent feedback to improve. It's a delta. It's not a step thing. And a whole bunch of other evidence that this isn't accurate. And if we were more accurate, if we designed our organizations work more closely the way our brains work, we'd be far more effective.
So, on the screen right now, for those who can see it, if you're listening to the podcast now, you can see it. But Clark has put there that he's known as Quinnovation. That's part of one of his companies. So I want to take you down this road for just a little bit, because you said all those acronyms. We've got virtual reality, we've got augmented reality, and now, of course, the talk of the day is artificial intelligence. Talk to me. What's been your experience about how that has impacted or is impacting our ability to create excellent learning experiences? Is it again another shiny object that you think people are chasing and forgetting the fundamentals? Again, I'm going to lead the horse there, as you did, obviously. But what's your opinion around these particular technologies, especially in the virtual realm and the artificial intelligence realm, and what do you see happening over in the near term, like the next 2 years or so?
Well, we are chasing the shiny object. I was recently reading something that said that, there is a psychology of the novelty of the new, and we chase it. And it's understandable. We are curious, our curiosity is one of the features of our cognitive architecture, and to the good overall. But I think, and you may have seen the Gartner hype curve, so there's this overinflated hype, and then there's this trough of disillusionment, and gradually we find the real value. And as somebody once said, we overemphasize the short-term benefits and underemphasize the long-term consequences. And I think that's possibly true. So what I regret is us not using these in sensible ways. There has been a long history, way back, Doug Engelbart and his Mother of All Demos showed how technology could augment our cognitive capability. And that's the right way to think about it. It's not man or machine. It's not person or processor. It's how do they work together best? And if you see chess has a place has emerged where human computer hybrids succeed better than the best humans or the best computer programs. And the ones that win aren't the best chess player or the best chess program. It's the ones that work together best. And so I think VR is great when we know when to use it critically, but not throw it at everything. And, I flash back to the days of Second Life and going into an event in Second Life, and it was a PowerPoint presentation in Second Life, which was a crazy thing to do because the cognitive overhead and the processor overhead were totally unnecessary. We had webinar software. We didn't need to do a PowerPoint in Second Life. We should do something more meaningful. The same holds true with VR. We should be using it when we need that immersive social capability. AR when we need to augment. And I think of AR more as a performance support tool than a learning tool. We've kind of gotten away from ARGs, which would be a really interesting alternate reality games. I don't know if people remember that acronym, but those actually had power for learning. And we've kind of went away from it. AI, the hiccups in the generative AI right now, the hallucinations, and Marcus Bernhardt talks about this pretty well, really mean you can't trust it alone. I hate when I see LinkedIn sending me an article generated by AI and going, comment on it. No, I'm not going to waste my time. You first have your own writers read it. I'm not going to fix things for you.
I want to point out to everyone that this is something that LinkedIn has started recently, where they actually have what they think is an important topic for their community, and they actually have an AI generated article, and then they say, hey, we think it's a good idea for us to let's community source it, come and correct it and this and that. It's like, well, why don't you get it right the first time? So I don't know.
Because one of them came out saying learning styles, which is a robust belief, and it's been thoroughly debunked scientifically. Talking about that in an article just shows that these tools are good at finishing sentences in ways that they've seen other people do, but they don't have any understanding of what's right or wrong or true or false. So the people who are using them as thinking partners, I think, have it right. See if it generates something you didn't think of it to put into your article. See if it can frame it in an interesting way, but you have to review what it says and take ultimate responsibility for it. So that goes back to the overall theme. Use technology as a partner to our brains, not as a replacement. Together, the whole is greater than some of the parts, but you have to understand what they each contribute to be able to do that well.
Clark, I've already taken up 40 minutes of your day, it's amazing to me how quickly this time always goes. But I want to give you the opportunity to kind of tie it in a bow there. If we were to think about bringing, L&D into the 21st century again, how would you summarize it so that, people can take it away from this conversation?
I would suggest that we had a major revolution in cognitive science that went from the formal logical reasoning to this more contextually sensitive, emergent cognition pattern. We need to acknowledge that in what we do in our learning designs, in our organizational designs, and our societal designs. That we also have had continual technology development. The internet, I think, was a major revolution. I was actually late to it because I had been following technology things. So there was the Usenet before the web. There was Waze and Gopher and these other tools. So when the web came out, I thought, oh, it's just another one. I'm willing to be wrong on that. But
you and Bill Gates, it's okay, no worries.
So the point being that we need to put these together in systematic ways, understand technology, understand our own thinking, and then figure out how they work together best. And that's when we do that, we have the opportunity to take L&D and our organizations forward more effectively. And that's what we should be looking to do.
Fantastic. Clark Quinn, I cannot thank you enough for taking time out of your busy day to speak with me here on the eLearn podcast. If somebody wants to find you, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Quinnovation.com is the best way to reach me. I'm wearing several hats now. I'm a co-director of the Learning Development Accelerator. I'm chief learning strategist for Upside Learning. I'm also advisor to Elevator 9, several full-time jobs. But quinnovation.com is the first place to find me. And from there, you can find my thinking on my blog at learnless.com. I tend to think out loud. And thank you, Ludwig, for the chance to talk to your audience and talk these ideas. I greatly appreciate it.
And I believe, we're recording this in September, but you're going to be speaking at DevLearn in October. Is that correct?
That's correct. I'm running a pre-conference workshop on better learning design, the emotional component, which we tend to neglect. Not only do we neglect the learning science, but we have good advice about that. But we also, engagement matters, and we don't have as good advice about that. So I'm running a workshop running a session on the learning science side of it. The retention and transfer should be our 2 goals. So yes, I'll be there. I look forward, if you're there, stop by, say hi.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.